The topic I'm going to dwell upon is probably not new to linguists, and it mostly deals with the operational tools of providing adequate translation equivalents for, at the first sight, seemingly untranslatable units. And scientists have always looked into the ways of choosing the optimal solution of rendering evaluative meaning, which seems to be one of the most, I would say, diverse or even problematic, with some complexities that, of course, will be different from one language to another. And if we are doing the comparative analysis of translation, we usually face the problem of finding the best solution for conveying the message the author embodied into his text. And this is, I would call it a modest case study, which will dwell into the I would say operational part of translation, regarding translating evaluative meaning of lexemes based on the novel by Ukrainian modern novelist Serhiy Zhadan, titled The Peshmot, and his translations into English and Russian respectively. Taking into consideration the relative non-relatedness of the languages compared, probably there may appear mismatches and probable linguistic difficulties of rendering the meaning, which can be achieved by substitutions of form on condition the meaning is preserved. Okay, let us focus on the text about. Of course, as for theoretical underpinnings, they always create a substantial background for any research. I have included here only some of them. And what specifically when it comes to the my case study, in my case study, I analyze lexemes and word combinations of colloquial style, slang, and colloquial language, and perform the comparative analysis at word level, look into the transformational patterns that structures undergo during literary translation into English and Russian, and discuss the advantages and flaws of applied translation strategies through adequate translation solutions. In my case study, the argument is made that the translation of substandard lexes reflects the interdisciplinary nature of expressive meaning and connotation, which can be conveyed differently through various language levels during literary translation. I treat low colloquial lexes as an array of substandard speech, colloquialism, slang expressions, various vulgarisms, jargon, and social dialects. And the hypothesis of the research is that while considering the complexity of expressivity in terms of its stylistic properties, various translation strategies, of course, can be used to preserve both the linguistic peculiarities of characters and the original coloring of the source text units in question. The relevance of the research lies in the difficulty of tackling translatability issues regarding the sublanguage lexes, which consist in presenting the ways in which the expressive meaning is externalized and communicated by linguistic means during literary translation. The subject of the research remains functioning of expressive and stylistically marked units in the source and target texts. Yes, regarding to the issue of style, choice, and effect, which remain central to stylistic, so, there are concern of translation strategies with regard to substandard lexis and its connotation, and examination of emotional words, expressions, endearment, and swear words. They enable to conduct pragmatic investigation of emotional language behavior, which might present very interesting results and observation that go into the comparative translation studies. In my study, in my case study, I treat register as a term that refers to the particular stylistic characteristics, and it is associated with a text type, subject, or degree of formality. I also stick to the principle that register variations arise from variations in the field of discourse and the tenor of discourse and the mode of discourse, but the topic of discourse analysis is not in question in the present study. I also claim that the translation might be evaluated less by its closeness to the source text and by whether it fulfills the stylistic criteria of the text type it belongs to in the degree of nature of interaction that allows to the reader. And while coming closer to the case study itself, I would like to say that the novel that is under the discussion is characterized by high concentration of low colloquial speech, primarily slang expressions usually used by the author to portray his personages whose colloquial character is revealed through lexical and phraseological units. Of course, the research discussed the possibility of translating stylistical low lexis on the material of substandard lexis used in the fiction discourse. It also illustrates the transformations which occur during literary translation. The study also questions whether in translation it is possible to preserve the flavor of the sourced culture and discuss the ways in which equivalence can be achieved. From the methodological part, I stick to the algorithm of descriptive translation studies suggested by Mona Baker. According to the researcher, the translation can be technically conducted by means of implementing such strategies or tools, as she calls it, and by a general word, more neutral, less expressive, cultural substitution, paraphrase using a related word, and paraphrase using an unrelated word even, and of course translation by omission. I would like to say that this descriptive analytical method allows for a detailed and systemic description of the material in question. I would like to say that representing the key voices in contemporary Ukrainian literature, Serhii Zhadan's style presents a masterful wordplay that have led critics even to approach his trademark as a verbal jazz, a description that reflects his unique style. Standing as a witness to the time of the great social change through the eyes of Ukraine's dispossessed youth, his novel explores the change he has witnessed himself as a representative of immediate post-Soviet generation in Ukraine. And of course, the writer's reaction to reality speaks to his experience of personal and national upheaval. And it partly explains the language the author uses, and actually the novel itself depicts Ukrainian youth during their turbulent 1990s. And from the author's perspective, it is a book about real male comradeship, and the novel follows the unemployed narrator and his friends. About the adventures and the way they as he calls, look for the true meaning in life. These are the theoretical fundamentals I would like to mention, just a few, that the corpus data, of course, includes the novel and two translations presented by Miroslav Shkarandy and Anna Brashkina, English and Russian, respectively. And of course, I stick to the principle that a comparative analysis to the implementation of translation strategies is to achieve closeness to the author's style. So how does the translators approach this difficult issue of rendering practically untranslatable units? Yeah. I have also provided the definition of the way I approach lexical and phraseological units in the novel. And I have also mentioned the fundamentals for translating whether it is necessary to render one word-for-word principle, or can we look for some alternative solutions to render substandard language, since the novel and its language is highly emotional and characterized by jargon, vulgarisms, obscene words, profanity, and immediate vocabulary correlates. And besides conveying expressive meaning, they produce an effect on the reader due to their stylistic features. Okay, now let's come to the practical part, I would say. What I have managed to come up with. I have done a selection of stylistically marked lexemes, and the comparative analysis revealed that the majority of source text, target text pairs constitute full equivalence, and they fully conform with the target language regulations, among which we can identify such sets of words. They can be illustrated below. The comparative analysis revealed the majority of this full equivalence can also relate to the attributives of evaluation. Of course, to the relatives of evaluation. The problem is that it's not always easy to find the counterpart in the target text. That's why the majority of translation patterns are characterized by similar expressive meaning. A slang expression, for example, acquires contextual translation correlates, and which indicates the possibility of introducing phrasal verb as a functional replacement to convey expressive meaning of the units in question. And for example, the colloquial expressions starve to death is substituted die of hunger, which is substituted to convey the same meaning. So actually there is a wide, I would say, application of synonymic resources of the target language, which is relatively new in this aspect. When we speak about the most difficult point, it's rendering humor. And the humor of the passengers relies on the manipulation of literary meanings. That's why the language of Serhiy Zhadan's Depeche Mode is, I would say, utterly difficult because it gives much space for improvisation, but at the same time it creates much complications in a sense that the translator needs to invent or to approach the most adequate way to render the meaning, which is not always the best, the easiest way. The majority of examples constitute non-equivalent, as I have mentioned, and translation involves finding an accurate counterpart to convey this expressive meaning, which is a rare place in Depeche Mode translations. And a translation strategy involves selecting an equivalent substitution for the word in question or simply omitting it, which eventually might not favor faithfulness. And while analyzing the text, I have noticed that there are many examples in which the words are literally omitted. They are not included in the target text due to the complexity of the notions presented. I would say that if there is a problem of finding non-equivalent representation, which is a commonplace in Sergei Zhadan's novels, we are looking for the near translation equivalence when one of possible synonyms is suggested, as it was previously illustrated. And while considering the example below, you can also mention that due to the contextual motivation, the analog can barely express the stylistic coloring, but the analog preserves its meaning and context dependence that will be understandable in target language. So I previously mentioned that the probably the most acceptable way to describe the translation techniques at word level suggested by Baker that lies in applying 6 strategies, and I would like to go into detail regarding the way it is presented in the translation I have analyzed. The first is translation by superordinate. This translation strategy is particularly effective for conveying propositional meaning of the missing hyponyme in the target language and illustrate the use of general word to overcome a relative lack of specificity in the target language compared to source language. And in this case, the source and target text pairs are abundant in cases of equivalent translation with immediate vocabulary correspondence. Immediate vocabulary correspondence. Yeah, the vocabulary correspondence. There is another case of translation by a more neutral, less expressive word, when the translator needs to neutralize lexemes, which in the source language possess an established negative evaluation and are genuinely stylistically marked. Basically, these words can be treated as near equivalents as well, but they can retain their grammatical reference, different grammatical reference, and they can be observed in the following examples here below. Well, speaking about omission, it's unfortunately, I can recognize that it's unfortunately because there are many interesting lexemes that were practically omitted throughout the translation. And in spite of the fact that this strategy may sound drastic, to omit a word or expression in some context appears appropriate, as I have come to the conclusion that, for example, there are some, I would say, swear words in Ukrainian. Such words do not have of course, the translation counterpart, and still they have been substituted by the phrase. Still, they by no means distort the overall tone of the message, since it might not seem vital enough for the reader to distract him by the lengthy explanation, which is, for example, is introduced here. And but still, it in this example, actually we see a completely different translation due to which neutralizing the expression does not lead to the distortion of the utterance, and basically criticizes the money issue and the way it affects life values. Still, I feel that there is some loss of meaning during emission about conveying national specific connotations here. Another tool for providing adequate translation is cultural substitution. Of course, there is so much to be spoken about the cultural substitution issue, but I have chosen only some illustrations to speak about. Actually, these culturally specific items, they constitute adequately selected national specific equivalents, and they can be markers of the, of course, source text culture. They need to be somehow translated appropriately, yeah? For example, there is some kind of slang word, law enforcement officers, actually it serves as an argot term for the police officer is rendered into English by means of paraphrase. And still it preserves the national target text connotation. And in order to give the ironic tone of the utterance, for example, and highlight the absurdity of the reality, as Sergei Zhadan described, and he uses this specific, I would say, culture-specific items, and the translator preserved the lexeme Marxist, that literally means an advocate of the political, economic, and social principles and policies, and ironically uses lexeme Kade is rendered by the conventional thinkers. That skillful combination reinforces the irony, while many obviously convey totally incomparable notions with a reference to the source language culture, which really can lead to mismatches and even to cultural misunderstandings in case we are not provided with a specific interpretation of the notions discussed. While speaking about another translation tool is the strategy that is applicable for dealing with culture-specific items and modern concepts. It's about loan word and loan word plus explanation. I guess there is practically nothing, I would say, nothing too complicated, I can say, because every language has got culture-specific items and modern concept to denote them. And the question remains, how are we supposed to render the meanings in order to help the reader understand the sense by transferring the culture concept as well? So here, in order to achieve translation adequacy, translators strive to convey and retain the stylistic peculiarities of source text and try to comply with the target language norms. From the translations into Russian and English, the examples I was analyzing, the examples indicate the fact that of the selection of adequate equivalents for the Ukrainian spoken vocabulary units, which faithfully convey their stylistic properties. And they also preserve expressive charge and semantic meaning as well. Now speaking about the translation by paraphrase using a related word, I really identify in my text, in my corpora, stylistic modifications and analyze lexemes with functional stylistic connotations. And I'm pondering upon the example, like a very stupid person, in evaluative sense. It is used in the text to express evaluation and to some extent even criticism or irony, and of course in the text can be readily used in some context in the derogatory way. Yes, and for example, in another illustration, the moron, offensive person affected by mild intellectual disability. The same description refers to the representation of the word havka, food, which refers to the jargon, possess an evocative meaning, that arises from variation in register and is contextually rendered by introducing the correlate group. So in case we stick to different languages, we can still look for the ways to find the best the optimal solution to the problematic translation cases, as it is illustrated above. Yeah, and just to sum up, I would like to say that actually in my case study, based on the translations, I have come to the conclusion that these analyzed texts really contain numerous examples of combining non-standard colloquial elements of everyday speech with the elements of modern professional jargon and usage. And my study also revealed that the elements from various language strata display a tendency to contrast with the main bulk of common literary words. And common literary words are usually deprived of specific coloring, and they usually do not constitute a problem for translation. What is interesting that the strategy I used before involves using loan words in the target text, and which roughly convey the same meaning that is the target text and source text consist of the equivalent lexical item. And unfortunately, this type of, I would say, complete match can only be occasionally achieved, though. Since the language is overwhelmingly, I would say, emotional, and the main bulk of the words to be translated is, I dare say, is not included into the dictionary. So there is a problem of finding the best correlate while translating into another language, into the target language. So with regards to foreign language inclusions, the Russian, for example, diminutive forms might be intentionally introduced into the text to add some favor to the post-Soviet past, with the translator partially substituted for the neutral, of course, some standard language. And I guess that this way the translator provoked a kind of, I would say, a kind of sacrifice of emotional coloring. Yes, while thinking about the conclusion, I can say that the first challenge I have encountered is that for adequate rendering of non-standard units, it's I would say, of prime importance to look for the composition discrepancy of lexical semantic groups, even though on the whole the lexical semantic meanings of source language and target text pairs in question overlap. What concerns slang, jargon, and colloquialism, they are formed by means of lexicosemantic variation as in any other language, but each language is characterized by its specific resources. And here I have noticed a limited number of units of literary language, as I have previously mentioned. Yes, as for lexicosemantic groups of unconventional units for English and Russian translations, they partly coincide. And still, one can trace considerable discrepancies among these pairs in the English, Ukrainian, and Russian languages. In terms of prepositional meaning, Ukrainian words correlate with English through the lack of expressive colloquial correlates cannot be used during the translation. The second complication I have faced is about pragmatic components of word meanings, originally equivalent by lexicosemantic equivalent, and it also causes mismatches during translation of non-standard units. Translating low colloquial lexis is characterized by compliances with the source text, style, and target text linguistic norms and culture. Of course, the main notion I would like to imply here is the is the notion of interlanguage transfer, which will always be felt throughout every possible translation, regardless of the lexis used, and substituting some colloquial language units by euphemistic ones can be justified by the accountability for considering the norms of register requirements of language culture. And of course, in target text, everything will be leveled to the target text recipient. Which is not always the best choice, but that's the way the translation strategy here worked out. As for the techniques of syntactic transformation used, because a lot of words were substituted by phrases, at the level of word combinations during translating jargon, slang, pejorative lexis, and the translator applied semantic narrowing of meaning in functional substitution. I also would like to say that the study demonstrates the shifts of law of colloquial register in translation, due to which the translator applies the neutralization of stylistically low colloquial vocabulary, by this way sacrificing some emotional coloring as well. The comparative analysis proves that the expressive linguistic resources primarily used not only to express emotions, but they also communicate complex messages about felt emotions and evaluation as well. I can also mention that the contrastive analysis of the translations I have conducted proves that language consists of the devices primarily employed to convey evaluation, and they are very, I would say, unconventional, so the optimal solutions need to be taken. In specific context may be recognized as expressive and carry some emotive attitude of speakers, disclose their personality traits, emotionality, and of course susceptibility. And my analysis material also demonstrates that the intensity of linguistic expression attests to the scalar of quality of emotive experience. That and different groups within each culture have different expectations about what kind of language is particular to situations. And the results of comparison prove that literary translation is essentially creative rather than a mechanical act. And yes, I guess that I'm very lucky to say that I am. I have contacted with the actual present living translator of Sergei Zhadan's work, and Rally Kostygan, and he works in Moscow, and partly he visits. Sometimes he visits Kyiv, and he is a keen supporter of modern translation movement, and he does much to revive the reputation of Ukrainian literature, as well as rendering historical aspect to the public, in order to make our culture close to the humanity, and to get to understand the way we function, we approach life, we see the world, and we express our views, expectations, and of course sorrows. Thank you for your attention.